There we see the screen.
Thank you very much, and again, most welcome to this lunch seminar titled Not My Job on the Challenges with Service Innovation and Development. This is selected work from a project within Software Center called Strategic Ecosystem Driven R&D Management. It has been running for a number of years, and it involves me and Jan Bosch as the researchers. So if we just give a little bit of a view of the focus of this project, for those of you who do not know the project, this project is focused on digitalization and the process of digital transformation of the embedded systems industry and the many challenges that are involved in this. For example, and as the primary focus, how this impacts the business ecosystem in which you operate. In particular, we study how companies manage the transition from being product-based towards becoming digital companies, meaning that software, data, and AI play an increasingly important role. And this involves a number of things. It involves to maintain and to nurture, of course, the existing ecosystem and the traditional business, which is typically transactional, while at the same time also prepare for and explore new digital business models that are typically then service-oriented. And the goal of our project is to provide you, the Software Center companies, with strategic guidance for how to make this transition effectively and as successfully as we possibly can. As a little bit of background, and based on the work from last sprint, we see that most of the Software Center companies look to now complement their existing physical offerings with new digital services. For these companies, service development and innovation is, of course, high priority and a primary area of attention. And it involves not only the development of the services, but of course also ways to monetize and to create not only additional revenue, but actually new revenue streams that were not present before and in relation to the traditional product. This, however, and as I will explain a little bit more during my talk, it's not trivial and it comes with a set of challenges. And just to mention a few, there are challenges or difficulties in relation to, for example, the prioritization and validation of new ideas, architectures, new payment infrastructures, and shortage of R&D resources that can actually work with this. Just to mention a few. And the talk then will present a set of challenges, like the key challenges that we identified during last sprint, and also some of the takeaways and the more generalized findings that we see. So if we look at this framework, some of you have seen it many times, some of you might be new to this framework, but what it does is that it evaluates or it presents the evolution from being a traditional to a digital company. And you see 4 dimensions. You see the product upgrade dimension, you see the business model dimension, you see data exploitation dimension, and you see the AI, ML, DL dimension. And if you look at the business model dimension, the staircase in the middle of the screen, this is where we have focused our attention during the work on service development. And at the 3rd step, this is where we see the Software Center companies being right now. This is where you start looking for how you can complement your existing products with complementary services to allow for, well, many things, new revenue, but also more effective use of data, a completely new, more continuous relationship with customers, etc., etc. If you would look at the 2 final steps, that's where you start monetizing based on your customer KPIs, where you look to fulfill what your customer finds most important. For an example, on-time delivery of goods. And then at the last step, multi-sided ecosystem model is where you basically use data from one customer base and you monetize it with someone else. That's a huge opportunity. We don't see that yet, but what we do see is that companies are now increasingly exploring step 3, where you look to use data coming back from your products to create new digital services around your products. And if we detail the third step here, this pictures then, well, the existing situation in the sense that in red you see that in most companies, or in the majority, in every company here, the majority of revenue comes from products. We already have some revenue from services, but this is where everyone would want things to change. You would want to increase service revenue quite significantly. Then in the blue, you see the real opportunities that come with exploring a two-sided or multi-sided market, which I already mentioned is not really happening yet. But what everyone communicates and what everyone is trying to do is to definitely increase what is green in this picture, so the service revenue part. And why is that? Well, if we ask the companies that we had the privilege to work with during last sprint, these are some of the main reasons. So already mentioned, it has a lot to do with performance. Everyone look to enhance performance. And the companies in this call, you already do this in several ways, but this is one typical reason for services. Another one is to improve the customer and user experience of the product. And that basically have to do with what is then mentioned in bullet point 3 and 4. You look to have a model where you can continuously learn from, monitor, get to know the customer, and where you can add value on a continuous basis. So you go from this is what I sold you to this is an enabler for things that I can sell you kind of relationship. And this involves shortening the distance to customers. So one of the companies mentioned that we would really want to be able to help the customer and to know what they need, which then by default means that you need to know the customer and how they perform. And you want to be able to be the one presenting to your customer what you feel based on how they do and how they use the system would be the best solution for them. And then in the last bullet, there is of course an advantage and an opportunity if you can forward integrate, meaning you take one step closer to the customer, you get access to customer data, etc., etc. So these are a few of the whys to complementary services. If we then look at what this could be and what these services, potential services could look like, again, performance, and I just mentioned truck uptime as one of those examples. There is the whole notion of product system health. So how is the system doing? How is it performing today? Availability, is it there when I need it? We have the area of life cycle and asset management, which I would say adds on top of the performance type of services. And with the use of data, you can also provide customers with insights on how they are doing. What is the productivity level? What is the quality, the goods damage, whatever domain you happen to be in. There are lots of insights that you could provide your customer based on the data that you collect from the field. You can also then help the customer to get better, even to compare with others. And you can recommend on future actions, be a bit proactive. There is the area of predictive and preventive maintenance. And then also to some extent, we have safety and security services, which was mentioned is not yet really taking off, but still very interesting. Now, if we then look at the challenges involved in this, which is the topic of the talk, we have identified a set of what we feel key challenges, and I will walk you through each and every one of these. So first of all, there are difficulties in adopting more of a customer and use case driven development approach. All of the software center companies are extremely good in technology, and you have very large and good partner networks, and it is easily so that we get stuck in this. We think what we can do based on our technology excellence, rather than what is it that the customer would want and need us to do. So the whole notion of transferring from more a technology-driven to a customer-driven development approach proves in practice very difficult. This relates to item number 2, which is that all of the companies have very mature, I would say, rich processes and methods when it comes to product development, and we have done this for years. When it comes to the more customer-centric methods that are required for successful service development, and as examples we can mention design thinking, more of the lean startup approaches, they of course work as guidance, but also they prove difficult to apply in practice based on the specific circumstances and needs of a B2B industry domain. So to apply these in practice in an agile setup, using DevOps, etc., is not trivial. As a third point, we see that the whole notion of agile teams and the cross-functional teams within R&D are very well established. They are mature, but these are not enough. So it's not enough for service development to involve different R&D functions. You also need to go beyond. You might need marketing, you definitely need sales, you could possibly even need different company branches to create a service that is related to the product, but that involves, I would say, more than just the product. So it's a bit of going beyond the existing cross-functional teams to something broadened. And then the final item on this slide is lack of payment infrastructures. If you would really want to test and validate a MVP with a customer, you can do that. But if you would really want to learn how something performs in the field, and if the customer is actually willing to pay, you need a payment infrastructure, which is typically not there when you start testing, exploring, and developing a service. The second slide of challenges lists additionally 3 challenges, with the first one being the difficulty or maybe inability to prioritize, test, and go beyond the existing. So when we hear the companies talk, those that we worked closely with during last sprint, they typically present us to a situation where top management asks for services with the desire to increase service revenue. And this leads to a situation where basically the whole company, so everyone everywhere, try to develop services and they come up with ideas, but there is no really good mechanism to prioritize and test these properly with customers. So you have an ocean of ideas, but you lack mechanisms to really prioritize and test. And what happens is you risk ending up in a situation where you focus your efforts on the Horizon 1 ideas, typically those that add services to the existing, but you don't really put enough focus on what would create something new. Horizon 3 in the sense of the new revenue streams, the things that were not even there before. So what you end up is in a situation where you increase service revenue, but you don't add new revenue streams. Then there is the lack of product capabilities, where you would want to offer a certain service, but maybe the basic product itself lacks certain capabilities. So typically you need a connectivity, you need a way of identifying and commute with associated devices, etc. And if these capabilities are not present, then the service, of course, won't fly until you have those capabilities in place. And then the very final one is the existing versus the emerging. And I think this is something that every company struggles with. You have legacy offerings and you have the potential of the many new service offerings, but often they address the same customer base and they tend to use the same company resources, and those are always limited. So it can lead to a situation where innovation initiatives starve a little because of basically lack or shortage of resources. So there is this balance of the existing versus the emerging. And with those challenges, I would want to also turn your attention to a few patterns that we have seen in the companies. And the first one being what we term gold plating pattern. There is a tendency to also, when it comes to service development, rather develop the perfect service, the perfect prototype, and the perfect MVP, rather than go out, create a small slice and evaluate it with customers. So the product development and the, what do I say, engineering mindset remains, and it is difficult to move to a situation where you, rather than presenting the perfect, evaluate a slice and then you improve based on the feedback. We see a pattern that we call the pink cloud pattern, where access to customers and basic mechanisms to reach customers are missing. And what happens is that then you keep building on assumptions, and these assumptions about the customer remain the basis for development. We have the OPAB pattern, which then relates back to the title of the talk, This Is Not My Job, where we see organizations, well-established cultures, product development organizations, silos of expertise, and innovation basically doesn't fit in. It is not part of my role, we hear people say, and it doesn't really fit in the traditional company structure. And it never will. It needs to live by itself and on its own. It never will fit into the existing. But this is a very difficult pattern to break out of and to make people embrace innovation as part of their existing roles. And then the last one is the whack-a-mole pattern, where we then mean that you always run into challenges, you always run into people or functions that need to come together and prioritize this initiative, but they claim or they argue that they are unable to prioritize it, and this brings you into a deadlock. And when you have finally convinced one, there is always someone else popping up. And for those of you who know the game, in the little bubble, you see what I refer to. You make one happen, and then there is the next to beat. But that's a pattern that we see typically happen when you want to introduce something new, but people feel that they are already too occupied, and this does not really get prioritized. So a few strategies and a few of the things that we have been recommending, we have been discussing on how to take forward is then, of course, start small, but start real. You really need to get going with the customer, so customer validation is critical. Don't ever assume that you know what customers want. You look to increase the speed of validation. And here again, the MVP is critical. Go out early and minimize the cost. Innovation initiative always cut across company functions and boundaries. It won't fit in. You just have to like it and embrace it and make it happen. And then you need to find mechanisms that allow individuals to provide feedback on innovation ideas for internal prioritization of these, so that you don't end up in an ocean of ideas, but without prioritizing the ones that will actually add new revenue. And then if I move on, I will outline a few of the generalized findings that we did during the sprint, where the first one is the different strategies we see companies take when they actually go and develop services. So the one being standalone and closed, where basically a company develops the service internally and the customer pick from your offerings. You can do standalone but open. You become like a platform company and you build a network of complementers. There is the notion of co-opetition, which means that competing companies find a way to cooperate for certain advantages. And this is then one, you can co-petition and open or closed. You can partner up with major players to build common services. Basically, it gives you the opportunity to share the effort with multiple players. And then in the open approach of co-petition, you agree on common APIs, architecture, support, etc., on which the collaborators can basically offer services on top of. So there are these different strategies you can take, and the one does not exclude the other. Then we see a few patterns in the sense of how companies explore and look to monetize new services, where the dark blue here relates to the more traditional product sales, where you then sell your product typically to your primary customer base, and then only after sales you could start exploring if there are potentially complementary services that could be monetized on top of the existing product. In the middle, we see examples of customers where you explore service opportunities and monetization in collaboration with, you could call them edge customers, like the smaller, to some extent less valuable, if I may use that term, but more open-minded and willing customers. And with them, you explore new service opportunities and also monetization mechanisms. And then finally, and as a third approach, we see companies that basically go to a new customer. So you explore service opportunities and monetization completely outside the primary business and with new customers. And then the very last framework I would want to show you has to do with the evolution of services. So this is a staircase where we present how we see services evolve over time. At the basis, we see the product-centric services, to some extent also the customer-centric services, that basically, if using the term commodity that we are already familiar with, these are the commodity services. These relate to product performance, product health, to some extent customer insights, etc., etc. This is where most of the companies are focusing right now. The challenge, however, is that these are also, and as you can see in red, typically the areas where monetization is limited. If you would really want to increase service revenue and add new revenue streams, you would want to move towards the more light blue steps, so the customer base centric services, where you not only provide insights to one customer, but where you can really start to benchmark and compare and do trend analysis and provide recommendations to customers. That's where you can find services that differentiate and that are paid for separately and that go beyond existing sales. And then finally, as a few reflections and conclusions, when we see companies experiment and explore these new services and new business models, they typically try to do it outside of their primary revenue generator for a number of reasons. One being you do not want to threaten your primary customer. You want to try it out with a smaller customer, etc., etc. So we see the focus being far enough from the primary customer base to not challenge them, but close enough so that people both internally and externally feel that this is relevant. You need to expand scope and identify new revenue streams that go beyond existing sales. Maybe that's not where you start, but that's where you need to go to really go beyond the existing sales and revenue. And then the last two ones marked in blue. The money is where you can support a continuous model. So you pay for movement, you pay for items, you pay for performance and productivity, etc. So continuous models. And then you need to shift to the focus to the customer. Many companies over and over explain how difficult it is to shift to a customer-oriented mindset, but this is really critical to identify where you need to be and what you need to do to meet the customer where they would want to place themselves in the future. And with those words, I would want to thank you everyone very much for listening. And I will stop sharing my screen so that I can actually see you. And I will also stop recording.